Okay, I'm going to talk about visual agnosia. Now this is a kind of disorder, perceptual disorder or deficiency that people have. Usually it's a result of some kind of like brain damage, usually like different types of like strokes. People get damage to certain regions of the brain which causes them to lack certain perceptual like qualities or faculties. So their eyes are fine, a lot of them are very intelligent people, they can function pretty much normally in most senses, but they have like these little quirks. So for example, there's two main types of agnosia that are very interesting in relation to remote viewing. So, because the same type of like underlying intelligences of the mind or faculties seem to be at play here. So, agnosia is not a disorder of the senses, okay? There's two types of agnosia that we're looking at here. So, there's aperceptive agnosia, which is like failure of object recognition. So, if I showed someone with aperceptive agnosia this marker, they wouldn't be able to like draw the marker. Like if I told them like draw a picture of this marker, they wouldn't be able to draw it. They can't take this visual information, take it in, create that impulse which gives the right response for them to perceive this, even this image. They can't even perceive the image properly. Okay? And then there's associative agnosia, which is people that they can get the forms, they can see the forms, they can form the mental image pattern, but then they're unable to associate the correct concepts or words, the names, to the actual objects. So one person wouldn't be able to tell me that this is a marker by looking at it, whereas the other person would be able to look at it and see that it's a marker, but wouldn't be able to name that it's a marker. Alright, so they could be able to draw it, but then after they draw it, they still wouldn't be able to look at even their drawing and be like, okay, I drew a marker. So it's kind of like similar to what happens in remote viewing, right? A remote viewer can draw an image that's exactly what the target is, and you ask them what it is, and they're like, I don't know what it is, right? So it's because there's these, it's like some kind of like conversation going on in the subconscious processing areas of these different units of information processing that speak to each other, but for some reason, you know, probably due to the brain damage in these people, those intelligences aren't kicking in. They're not playing their role. So it's putting stress on another area of their perception, and usually they get things wrong. So here's a video clip of someone with visual associative agnosia. So they're getting shown a bunch of different objects, and they usually have to resort to, you'll see one object, he smells it, and that puts him on the right track. He has to use his hands to like feel the objects. At one point, his hands give him the answer. So he's looking at this object, which is a combination lock, and he doesn't know what it is, and not until his hands are doing this motion of like opening a lock that he looks at his own hands and says, oh yeah, it's like a combination lock. So that's like an example of like this other intelligence kind of like speaking through the body to convey some information that, you know, the part of us that we think of as our intellect or the intelligence part, it doesn't get all the information. It's not just one piece. It's like a team that works together within us that gives us these fully formed impressions. And during remote viewing, since you're getting like disjointed pieces of information, like you're not getting all the information at once, you suffer from like kind of like the same thing that someone with like this agnosia is going through. You don't get you're not getting all the pieces of information, so you know all the intelligences aren't necessarily kicking in at the right time to give you the right information. So you form this kind of like incorrect image. So here's an image. Here's a video of this person with visual agnosia, associative agnosia, and just listen to the dialogue, look at the person's hands and what they say, and you know, if you're into remote viewing, you can recognize that it almost sounds like someone being interviewed at a remote viewing session. It's kind of like this struggle to work within oneself to figure something out. So check this out.
Name a few things.
Okay.
What is that?
Apple.
Okay, good. And what is that?
Candle.
Good.
Crayon type stuff, you know.
Okay, which is it?
Crayon. Because that smells better.
Is this a crayon or a
That's
candle?
a crayon shaped like a candle. Really?
Well, if it's shaped like a candle, why wouldn't it be a candle?
Because it smells like a crayon.
Oh, I didn't notice you smell. What is that?
It's a pipe.
Okay, good. Sure. And I'd like to have you just tell me what you do with that.
Right with it.
I don't want you to tell me. Show me what you do with it.
You're right.
I'm sorry.
It's a pen, you know.
Hold your hands up here where we can see and show me what you do with it.
You're right with it. It's like a ballpoint pen, you know, but it's not a ballpoint pen.
Well, take your time and see if you can show me what you do with this.
Well, you're right with it, but you know this. I don't know, because I know it doesn't come into focus right. You know, is that a flute or something?
Okay, that's close. What is that?
I don't know.
How'd you figure that one out?
Because that's not the way I put my hands, I know. Because I've never been in a flute, and that's the first thing I thought of.
Uh-huh. Did your hands figure out before you had it in your mouth? Mm-hmm.
That's weird. What is that?
That's a clarinet.
Ah, it's close.
That's very close. That's good. Happens sometimes you get something stuck in your head.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so I want you to give up the telephone. It's not a telephone.
Okay. Okay. I'm really at a loss. I can't. It just isn't making any sense at all now.
Is it bigger than a cat or smaller than a cat?
Than a cat? Well, it's probably smaller than a cat.
About what size is it?
Oh, it's about that long.
Mm-hmm. About what size is it? Telephone. Just
about yay by yay.
So this is smaller than a telephone?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does it have anything to do with communication?
Yeah, because this is the numbers you gotta hook up with them in order to dial your number or something, you know.
And why do you dial the number?
Because that's evidently what that dial is for. I don't know. Yeah.
Let me give you a hint.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a choice, and you tell me what this is.
Okay, I can tell you then.
Okay. Is this a clock, a lock, or a telephone?
A lock.
Is it a lock?
A clock, a lock, or a telephone? Okay, let's rule out a telephone. What? A clock or a lock? Clock. Gotta be a lock. Must be a lock then.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not. But I don't recognize it as a telephone.
Mm-hmm. Do you recognize it as a lock?
No, honestly, I don't. But it's just it really looks very indescript to me.
Uh-huh. But your hands know what they want to do.
I know,
with
and
it.
they want to do something.
That's right.
I can see them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I can just picture them, and I know that I have It's like I'm undoing a combination lock.
Good.
Huh.
Okay, good. We had to work on that one, didn't we?
No shit.
So as you can see there in that video, kind of like the different intelligences that are like in play when one hits like a roadblock, you know what I mean? He's looking at this thing and he's seeing the picture, it's there, but the actual faculty or intelligence inside that actually kicks in and recognizes and associates the name or the concept to that image, it's lacking. So it took the intelligence of the hands, whatever intelligence that is, some body intelligence, to kind of like send him a different message, like, oh, the hands would go like this, and through that he came to a recognition of what it was, right? So the same thing can happen in remote viewing. Alright, reducing AOL is more about learning about these different intelligences and interpreting them the right way, right? So at one point he was convinced that the combination lock was a phone. He was talking about the number dial, and he's like, well, evidently that's used for dialing in numbers, and that's how you like call people. That's exactly like what happens in a remote viewing session. A viewer gets one piece and they say, well, of course that's used for this, so therefore it must be that. And that's that thinking stuff we were talking about earlier, when you're comparing and making deductions about things. So it got to a point where he was thinking about things. He wasn't actually in the act of actual perceiving, right? And even at one point the woman said, sometimes you get things stuck in your head, so let's try and leave that idea alone. Well, the same thing happens in remote viewing. Your analytical mind, your conscious mind, the awareness part of you that wants to come to a conclusion, that intelligence is always trying to make a conclusion for you, and once it makes that conclusion, it wants to hold on to it. So sometimes you gotta let that go, and that's what AOL is about: writing it down, letting it go. And after you do that enough times, you'll learn to relax that faculty. Here's another clip of another man who has a certain type of visual agnosia, and so he's looking at this photo. He's able to make out certain aspects of it, but when he tries to think about it or come to a conclusion on it, he completely butchers what it is, and he draws a bunch of logical fallacies and comes to incorrect conclusions. Basically the same type of thing happens in a remote viewing session. This is almost exactly like what happens to most people in a remote viewing session. So check it out, and you can kind of see how the same type of faculties are at play here. The same type of phenomenon is going on in the person that has these missing faculties from the stroke or brain damage, and a remote viewer who's working with disjointed partial information.
What about this one? There's a dog. No, well, all right. It's either a real dog or a dog model, because I can work out that it is a dog squatted down.
What about this in the background? What would you make of that?
I'm trying to, at the moment, to make some sense out of it. It could be a tree of sorts, or a very large shrub.
Is it out of doors or indoors in the picture?
Well, if it's a shrub, then it must be out of doors.
I'm quite sure about that.
Well, I can't see why a shrub that big.
What do you think this is here?
I imagine from the shape of it, it must be a door into a house.
A door into a house?
Into a house, I think. Because it's obviously a heavy door.
Well, what would you say that was then?
I imagine that's a picture. No, it can't be a picture. Because if that was the outside of the house, you're not going to have pictures hanging, at least you're not likely to have pictures hanging on the outside. I, having so far worked out that it is an exterior picture, she's pointed out to something which I thought perhaps was a window, which doesn't look too much like a window when I try to work out what it is. So,
What's this round here on the bottom of the tree then?
well, I was going to say that was some sort of ornamental collection of stones or something on a pathway.
Well, I think I put you out of your misery. It's actually a Christmas tree in a room with Sheba sitting beside it.
Well, I mean, really, that's a
Those are the presents.
that's a cheap picture.
So the main thing, you know, I want you to take away from this whole thing is that there's a difference between the impulse. There's a difference between the impulse and the response. Okay? And there's a difference between the response and your analysis of the response or thinking of it. Alright? So, impulse is not, it's an energetic phenomenon. It's something that you feel. It doesn't have words. It becomes specific once your consciousness, your awareness can make it into something that makes sense. It makes an impression on your awareness. The impulse makes an impression. What's an impression? Well, you know, not only like an impression, like a stamp, like when something's impressed on you, but like impression, like you're trying to copy something. You know what I mean? Your best rendition, your best impression of someone. So you're gonna give your best impression of the impulse, and you know, an impression is never gonna be the exact thing, right? It's like trying to be the thing, you know. And if you're good enough, if you're good at giving impressions, or doing impressions, then you know you're gonna do a pretty good job at turning the impulse into an impression. Now, you can have a response, you know, to the impulse. The impulse will usually be something abrupt, something that drives you, something fast. It's not something you think of. It happens right away. As soon as you did that probe, this impulse came, and it usually drives you to do something. All right, which is like the response. So this causes something. The response doesn't cause something per se. It doesn't cause something, but it can cause you to think about it. You know, if your analysis thinking comes in, yeah, it can cause you to think. You can think about this and cause something else to happen. All right. So basically, in remote viewing, you're practicing turning these impulses into responses without thinking about them. All right, without analyzing them. As you get deeper in the session, and the impulses get stronger, your responses, or your ability to give responses that better match the impulse, will become better. They'll become stronger impulses, and you won't be worrying about thinking about them. You're not going to be worrying about thinking about the responses. The responses will be more in line with the target. That naming it, you're going to be on the money. You'll be on the money. You know what I mean. You won't even know it, but you're going to be on the money. So it's a subtle difference. You got to learn how to not do this. Don't think about the response. You move on to the next probe. You move on. You move forward. It's like playing music. You don't stop to read the last note, whether you got it right or wrong. So AOL, to some extent, will always occur because there's an interface between what we call perception and knowledge. Perception and knowledge, they interface with each other, okay? So, you could perceive something, but you gotta have a knowledge of it in order to, like, explain it or communicate it in some way, right? So, this is where AOL happens, and sometimes the reason to not be afraid of AOL or not to avoid AOL is because you may be avoiding you're going to be avoiding the interface to the target. Like, that's where if that's the only thing in your knowledge that matches the perception, well then you got to use it, right? You can just work on building a bigger library of like mental vocabulary, you know what I mean? The more you read, the more words you know, the more concepts you're aware of, the more expanded your awareness, the better you'll be at getting the right perceptions, right? Explaining the perception correctly, right? So there's like this interfacing that happens. So that's why there's always like some kind of overlay that may occur. That's just how communication works, right? Perceiving something is not as basic as it seems on the surface. Like I was saying with the whole cause and effect, it's not just like stuff comes in and then it's just there. It's a couple stages to it. So like detecting a feature is a separate process from like sensing it, like in the first place. So like something gets sensed, then you got to detect what you sense. You got to detect something from there, detect a feature. So you detect something from what you sensed, right? And then from what you detect, you create a pattern. Create a pattern, and then from the pattern, it's got to get recognized. The pattern has to be recognizable. Has to get recognized. And then, after you recognize it, you got to associate the correct like concept or name. Concept, stroke, name. To what's recognized. Okay? So, there's like, you know, there's a bunch of things that go on here. So, you know, you're getting raw data, gets sensed. You know, whether you detect something out of that, whether you detected anything, that's a whole nother question. Whether there's a discernible pattern from that, then, you know, more data can be lost there. Things can be distorted, misunderstood. Then there's a, you know, is it recognized? Is the pattern recognized as an actual thing, something that you can actually turn into a word? And if it is, can you associate the right concept or word to that thing? So it's, you know, this is what happens. It's not as like clear as night and day, and the more you do remote viewing and you have these experiences happen and you get the feedback, the better you're going to be at sensing, detecting, and recognizing and associating the correct concepts and ideas and names to the impulses, alright? And that, yeah, that can eventually lead to, yeah, naming stuff and, you know, calling it right out. You don't have to, you can build a certain level of confidence in your ability. So a lot of this has to do with confidence. Once you get more confident, you're gonna list the impulse. You're gonna list your responses without even thinking if they're an AOL or not. Okay, because you're gonna gain a certain amount of trust in your abilities and in your intelligences, right? Like you wouldn't question whether the ground is underneath your feet right now, right? Because, you know, you trust the feeling from your feet. Well, with remote viewing, you know, you can get to the point where you're gonna get a certain amount of trust in the signals that you get from your body.